if political stability goes up, then Bitcoin gives you the kind of result. If assets go down in value because of political instability, then Bitcoin goes up in value. The way we can think of Bitcoin in that context is that it's neutrality technology.
Welcome to Partner Path, a podcast that unpacks the venture capital and growth equity ecosystem from a junior perspective. Young entrepreneurs and investors have already had a massive impact on the industry, having started unicorns and launched billion-dollar funds. We discuss these success stories and more by sharing perspectives and advice from some of the industry's most prominent role models. This podcast expresses our views as of the date published and does not represent the views of and is not endorsed by any company for which we work.
Today we welcome Tycho Onnasch, General Manager of Trust Machines and co-founder of Zest Protocol. Originally from Amsterdam, Tycho attended Oxford University where he studied history and politics. His founder journey started after college when he founded Deedmob, a SaaS product for NGOs and local governments. After Deedmob, Tycho transitioned to Trust Machines, which builds infrastructure and applications for the Bitcoin economy. While at Trust Machines, Tycho founded Zest Protocol, the first on-chain Bitcoin lending protocol. Welcome, Tycho.
Yeah, thanks very much for that intro. I'm looking forward.
So first, it would be great if you could touch on your personal background and upbringing. Where are you from and how has that influenced who you are today?
You kind of mentioned already, so I'm originally from Amsterdam, from the Netherlands. I had a kind of fairly regular kind of Dutch upbringing, but really wanted to study abroad. The thing about the Dutch education system is that if you get high grades, there's not really a point to it. If you just get a pass, then it's fine. You can go to university and everything there. But I felt I was getting good grades and going somewhere, but there wasn't really anything to use it for. So then thought, hey, let's apply to Oxford and go to the UK. That was really sort of when international world opened up more and got more in touch with technology and a bit out of the traditional background and got excited about tech.
You mentioned the traditional Dutch upbringing look like. What does that look like and how does it compare to your knowledge of the US upbringing?
It's very different. The main way it's different is very laid back. It's famously Dutch kids are known as the happiest kids in the world from all these surveys. That is very nice. There's not a lot of pressure and everyone can do their own thing. But at the same time, if you want something more, if you maybe are ambitious or something, it's maybe sometimes looked down on is maybe not the right way to say it, but like looked at with some suspicion. It's like, oh, well, if you want to do all these things, like maybe there's something else going on. Maybe we should help you with something there. Yeah, I would say in that sense, it's quite different from America. Right? From a very young age, it's about performing and, doing well.
And your entrepreneurial career started relatively young at Deedmob. So what inspired Deedmob at such a young age?
We never really set out to build a software company or even to build a company. Me and a couple of friends at Oxford, and it was kind of in my second year, so it was kind of nearing the end because it's a 3-year degree. And yeah, then got together with these friends and we thought, let's build a volunteering platform. So one of them studied computer science. Then we knew some NGOs locally because we've been doing some volunteering, and then thought, that's maybe like a nice thing to just do alongside studying, right? And as sort of a side project. And then we started with that and it started getting some traction and more people went on it. And then we thought, wait, let's launch it in the Netherlands as well, because 2 out of the 3 that were there in Oxford were from the Netherlands. And then it got some traction there as well, right? I mean, this was the kind of time of Uber and Airbnb and sort of platform economy, everything. So platform for volunteering made a lot of sense. And then we thought, hey, if we really want this to grow and we want this to continue to exist, then the way to do that would be to incorporate it as a company and try to find a sustainable business model behind it, right? So that's very much where it came from. So it wasn't really a sort of grand master plan, but yeah, quite a spontaneous way to begin.
And it was a SaaS platform for volunteering that sells into the government, you mentioned?
Yeah, that's what it turned into. So it started just as a volunteering platform that anyone could access, and still today people can find volunteering opportunities there. But yeah, then the main feedback that we kept getting from NGOs and local governments and people that were using the platform was like, hey, this is such a great platform. I would want to have this, right? Like, I'm the Red Cross in the Netherlands and I would want to have this platform in my own branding. That would be so great. And we were like, well, no, it's our platform, so you need to put it on ours. And then at some point we realized, hey, maybe these people are willing to pay to have our platform in their own brand. And then we did it for one, and then we did it for another one. And then we were like, hey, if we standardize this in a good way, then it becomes SaaS.
And what year did you leave Deedmob?
That was at the start of 2021.
And then I guess switching over to Bitcoin, your interest in Bitcoin, I read, started a lot younger, actually at age 14, if that's correct. So how were you exposed to Bitcoin at such a young age?
When I was in school, we were in economics class and we all had to do these presentations, right, about something we found interesting. And there was one guy in my class that gave a presentation about Bitcoin. And that was the first time hearing about it. I thought it was quite interesting, this idea of a kind of money that's on the internet. It was very, very interesting to dig through. So I knew it existed, didn't do much with it at the time. It was not really a way you could buy this anyway. This was in 2011 or so. Then in 2014, went to Oxford, and then a couple of years later came across some people that heard about this thing called Ethereum, smart contracts. One of the co-founders of Ethereum, Gavin Wood, had been running around at Oxford for some time before founding Ethereum. And that was like one of the first times that I heard people who I thought were legitimately smart. So then I was like, okay, this is definitely interesting, and start looking at it with friends and realize, okay, there is something here. And then 2016, 17, then you got the first big bull run about smart contracts and stuff like this when it really burst more into the mainstream. Then we had already started Deepmob. So I was like, no, I'm going to keep going with this. It's very unclear yet how you could build a company around this crypto stuff. You could build an exchange, but you need to be quite financial for that. Or you can build an ICO platform, but then you're kind of building some sort of a legal fundraising tool. And it wasn't really clear what sustainable thing could be built. And then in 2021 or 2020, DeFi really burst onto the scene. And then it was like, okay, this makes sense. The first time that people use smart contracts in a sustainable way, building these DeFi protocols in a way that is actually sustaining some business activity. And that was very cool. And then it all kind of clicked for me.
So that was the aha moment in 2020 that kind of inspired you to go all in.
Yeah, definitely. In 2016, 17, I've been buying some stuff, looking at smart contracts and thinking of all the different use cases that it could be used for. Maybe it could be used for tracking supply chains better, or maybe it could be used for payment systems or other things. But it wasn't really clear to me what would be like the first thing that you could build with it that would bring real value. In 2020, DeFi came around and it was clear, right? Specifically because people have been using centralized exchanges before. People have been borrowing against their crypto before. Now you can do it with smart contracts. So it's sort of a very good fit for an early first use case that can actually take off.
I know that you did mention that Bitcoin is the single biggest lever to achieve positive change in the world. So maybe touch on that smart contract development that you keep mentioning and why it is such an important development, the concept of Bitcoin.
If we look at how our societies are structured today, or what's the most important thing, it's very rapidly becoming the internet. And we're producing about 2 exabytes of data. And this is about the same amount of data that we produced in human history before the year 2000 or so. And now every day or every 2 days, we're producing this amount of data. So it becomes very important to start storing that data in an incorruptible way, essentially, right? And right now it all goes to AWS or it all goes to Google Cloud or something where it's stored. But at the same time, every day we have 150 megabytes that can be stored on the Bitcoin blockchain. So that can be this sort of secure computing layer where you can incorruptible way store data, which become very important if we want to start using the internet more and more. It has a very big power to play a very significant role for good in the world.
Maybe it'd be helpful just to ground the group on Bitcoin and DeFi more broadly. First, in your eyes, what is decentralized finance and why is it an improvement over the current centralized finance structure that we have in the world today?
Or well, let's talk about what is finance. Maybe we should start with that. Finance is essentially the set of real world contracts that people have with each other or with banks or things like that to manage risk in the future.
Exactly what a dollar is a contract with the bank saying they have amount of backing.
Exactly. You owe me an IOU essentially. So these are like objects that exist for us to manage risk over time, and that we can have a retirement. And if we fall ill, then there's something there for us. And effectively, these contracts are enforced by the government in some way. And now if we think about smart contracts, are essentially ways to create these types of contracts through blockchains enforced by decentralized computing networks. They are not necessarily finally enforced by the government, but they are just enforced by a decentralized set of computers. So if the contract says it will do something, then it will actually do something. And you don't have to trust the state or a government that it will always work. As we see that some states that we thought would always work very well for us are maybe, not working so well for us anymore. I think everyone has some of their own grievances with politics or the way certain things are going in whichever country that they are. This essentially offers a way out to keep doing these things, but then do them in a way that is independent of politics, essentially.
And you've mentioned smart contracts a couple times. Maybe could you just touch on exactly what you mean?
It's effectively a way to write a piece of code that says something that what a contract says. If someone does X, then Y happens, and so on. And then if you place that piece of code on the blockchain, right, and we say, if Will puts 1 Bitcoin in here, Tycho is going to get this other thing, this other token or something else. Then if you then put that 1 Bitcoin in there, we always know it will execute in that way, and then it will give something to me. Smart contract there is a way to create a contract between us that then is enforced by a decentralized computer. Bitcoin has that in a very limited way. Ethereum has much wider support for very expressive kind of things you can do, like if this, if that, if that, if that. You can sort of go almost as crazy as you want. And at Trust Machines, we primarily work on bringing that type of functionality to Bitcoin, essentially making it possible for Bitcoin to be used in a similar way.
And maybe you could just touch on a little more in depth of what Bitcoin's role is in DeFi today.
So today, Bitcoin barely has a role in DeFi. The main thing that people do with Bitcoin today is that they hold it and they hope it appreciates in value. It's rarely used for financial purposes inside smart contracts. The only way you can kind of currently do that is if you move the Bitcoin onto another blockchain, say the Ethereum blockchain, and wrap it, is sort of what it's called. So you essentially give your Bitcoin to some kind of company, and then that company gives you sort of an IOU, right, on another blockchain and says, well, this represents a Bitcoin, so now go use this. But now we have kind of created the same problem, right, that we started with, that you just have IOUs for things. Currently, Bitcoin is not really integrated in the decentralized finance ecosystem, while it's the biggest crypto asset out there. And it's the one asset that a lot of people hold that they would want to generate yield on, or that they would like to borrow against, like some very basic things you can do with financial applications. But yeah, today that's very difficult to do. And that's why a lot of people were using some platforms like BlockFi and Celsius that all disappeared or imploded in very spectacular ways over the last year. And so it's definitely time to rebuild this in a better way.
And how would you say the impact of changing political international tension kind of impacts the value that the trust of decentralized computers? Maybe 12 months ago, there was a big reliance or assumption of a certain level of globalization and trust among countries. And obviously with the Russia-Ukraine tension and whether it's the China-US relationship that's going on, I think there's been a movement away from that assumption of a certain level of globalization, and that impacts the actual value add that a decentralized product like this has. I'm curious to hear how you think that's impacted the adoption over the past 12 months.
The most interesting adoption path for Bitcoin today is as a hedge, an asset to hold in financial terms that hedges against global instability, or that basically hedges against all those things that you mentioned. A hedge in very simple terms is, well, if political stability goes up, then Bitcoin gives you the kind of result. If assets go down in value because of political instability, then Bitcoin goes up in value. The way we can think of Bitcoin in that context is that it's neutrality technology. It's like technology that's basically made in such a way where it's always neutral, or where the word for, or the name of the company Trust Machines comes from, is this idea that Alan Turing created the first Turing machine, right? The first kind of computers in the 1920s, where you could give it an input and then it gives you an output, right? So you say 1 + 1 and then the computer says 2. And now it's a Turing machine because you can give it inputs and then it gives outputs. But you need to trust that the Turing machine computes in an honest way. But with networks, such as the Bitcoin blockchain, you essentially created the computer that produces trust. If you give it an input, you can trust that it will always give you the correct output, or it will always calculate the output in the same way. And yeah, that's really new technology, and that allows for people to transfer value freely. And basically that, as that gets less free or more difficult in certain parts of the world, then it will likely be more valued.
And I think that's a great transition into chatting about Trust Machines. You guys have received upwards of 150 million in funding from prominent VCs to help build infrastructure and applications for supporting the use of Bitcoin, really. I'd love to hear a little bit more about what you guys are tackling.
The founder of Trust Machines is Munib Ali, who also founded Stacks, which is essentially a layer 2 blockchain that builds on top of the Bitcoin blockchain, right? So a project that brings programmability to Bitcoin. So the background of Trust Machines sort of very much comes from the success of Munib building the Stacks layer. And then he teamed up with his old professor from Princeton, a guy called JB Singh, to essentially co-found a company together that builds Bitcoin applications. That's essentially going to use all the advances in technology, right? Whether it's the Lightning Network, which allows faster payments for Bitcoin, or the Stacks layer, which allows for more programmability to Bitcoin, to essentially use all of that technology to then build applications that real people will use, onboard that first billion users, right, to Bitcoin. That's essentially what the mission is there. Before we can really bring Bitcoin to billion users, there's a lot more infrastructure related work that needs to be done. There's more scalability that needs to be added to layers like the Stacks layer and so on. So that's where a lot of the early work of Trust Machines has been going. But then in terms of the sort of focus areas for the company, one part is DeFi, right, or decentralized finance. That's what I primarily work on and have worked on. Another part is chat. There's a lot of really exciting developments around an application called, or a protocol called Noster, which is effectively a way to leverage the Lightning Network, which settles on Bitcoin, to create Twitter-like or chat-like applications like Signal, but then where everyone can sort of run their own relays. And we've also done a lot of work on Lightning and bridging Lightning to other places. Very foundational work right now.
Exactly. What is the long-term business model for Trust Machines, out of curiosity?
In the long run, the bet is really that the people that have built the early infrastructure will be the people best positioned to build the applications that will capture the most value from that infrastructure. In the future, 1, 2, maybe 3, 4, 5 years, maybe 10 years, the applications that we're building will gain mainstream usage as the Bitcoin network becomes the money protocol for the internet. This will do very well. And that way, it's very much constructed as a sort of almost a moonshot on the back of Bitcoin adoption. Then this will become radically successful. We also see ourselves as instrumental in getting Bitcoin to the next level there.
And would love to have you touch on Zest Protocol for the listeners, and specifically what components of Zest, what features of Zest differentiate it from other more common lending platforms.
So while working at Trust Machines, the idea was always, for me and some of the early team there, to essentially incubate a lending protocol from Trust Machines that would use some of the core technology that Trust Machines has contributed to essentially create a decentralized application where people can earn yield on their Bitcoin, right? So they can park their Bitcoin on there and they can earn more Bitcoin with it, or they could borrow against their Bitcoin. Essentially, we're building Zest Protocol on top of the infrastructure that we worked on at Trust Machines. The two things that we're looking to build is people can send their Bitcoin to Zest Protocol and start earning more Bitcoin with it, or they can send their Bitcoin to Zest Protocol and they can borrow against it, right? So if you would not want to sell your Bitcoin, but you might want to make a real life purchase, you can, within a single Bitcoin transaction, get a dollar loan or a stablecoin loan in that way, because it comes from decentralized contracts, essentially make real life purchases.
Could you spell out a little bit more clearly on exactly how Zest is making money in those transactions? Is it similar to like kind of a bank, or what would you compare it to in today's economy?
The best way to maybe think about it, bank is maybe it's always a bit dangerous to sort of use that comparison in crypto land, but effectively Zest Protocol takes a transaction fee, or it takes like a fee for the yield that it generates. So let's say that I put 1 Bitcoin on Zest Protocol and I, over the course of a year, earn 5% yield with that. Now I've got 1.05 Bitcoin, and then Zest Protocol would take 5 or 10% of that. And that's how the protocol finances itself.
And I guess, given it's a capital market solution, what I guess would you say the biggest risks are that Zest faces today?
Once we're live, right? So currently we've essentially built all the core pieces of it and lined up the first users, but it's not yet on mainnet. It's not yet sort of fully out there for people to use. The main sort of pieces to look out for that we will be working on is, well, first, bootstrapping adoption. These things only work if there is a certain level of capital sitting on there. It needs to get used to a certain degree before people sort of say, okay, this is now the standard for generating yield on Bitcoin. So that's number one. And then 2, it's set up the protocol and the governance in such a way that it's always making loans to the most creditworthy parties, and that there is not a Alameda or a Three Arrows Capital in there. Those are two of the hedge funds that very famously exploded in the last year that took a lot of the crypto space with it. And effectively to lend to very reputable parties there and set up the protocol in such a way that this is also fully transparent to everyone, and that the moral hazard that we saw last year is not as rampant. So I would say those are really the two things for us to watch out for.
And how has the downfall of lending firms like Three Arrows impacted the adoption of these types of lending platforms?
It's been very, very interesting, right? So I think on the one hand, right, it's been very bad for everybody. You can talk of silver linings, but that's the first thing to really emphasize. The sort of long-term impact I think that it really has is that, people value the transparency of blockchains more, because effectively all these companies, they were structured as traditional hedge funds, but then they were doing something in the crypto space, or they were structured as an exchange, like give me your coins and then we will trade with it, or we will allow you to trade, but it always stays in our wallets. That was what happened with FTX. And then people looked under the hood and it wasn't in their wallet. This is a finance problem. It has nothing to do with the fact that this is crypto. It's really created a new appreciation for actually using blockchains for what they're good at. It's creating transparency and maybe not sort of taking too many shortcuts for being, okay, well, it's just faster if we all put it in one company, or it's faster if we just all aggregate everything in one place. People want more transparency there and better products. And I think that is sort of over the long term, the kind of stuff that Trust Machines is looking to build, that Zest Protocol is looking to offer when it comes to Bitcoin finance. And so that it's kind of a tailwind that's a bit necessary for people to value the work that we do.
And I'd love to hear a little bit more about why you think credit and lending is so important to the general success of Bitcoin and adoption of Bitcoin.
Almost among anything, it's probably the most important thing to get Bitcoin credit going, to get Bitcoin adopted, or to help it grow. If we really zoom out, all the way out, Bitcoin will only succeed if there is a Bitcoin economy. If people are transacting in this currency, and if there are companies that have earnings in Bitcoin and that can take Bitcoin in and earn more Bitcoin with it. So that's kind of the crucial piece for making this sustainable and getting a sustainable volume behind the asset. Economies need credit to grow. Without credit in the world, we wouldn't have all these nice things. We probably wouldn't be talking on video link across the world right now without credit, or without the ability to be able to play with the factor time. The same thing sort of applies to Bitcoin. Now, there are a lot of companies that earn Bitcoin, right? Like think trading firms. They borrow Bitcoin and then they trade with it, and then they earn more Bitcoin, and that way they make markets more efficient. At the same time, you have Bitcoin miners. Right? Some of them borrow Bitcoin, then they sell that, they build out their mining facilities, and in that way they secure the network with sort of more mining power. These kinds of companies need to be able to access credit from somewhere, and that's become very difficult, right? Because they used to use these big companies, these big centralized exchanges or lenders to finance themselves, and now it's become much trickier because people don't really trust them anymore. But there's still people out there that are very legit that need credit, so that's the problem we're looking to solve.
I think that's a good transition to some of the macro trends we are seeing, and how the US has really struggled to define not just what policies to promote, but also what the goals of those policies should be related to Bitcoin. So we're curious, how has the US government's regulation or lack thereof contribute to its failings?
That's a really big one, and I can sort of talk very freely there. I mean, these are of course my opinions, and not Trust Machines' opinions or anything like that. I would say that specifically the way that the US has approached crypto has been very counterproductive. To quickly paint the picture, there's no entity that's been able to claim regulatory jurisdiction over Bitcoin, the assets, or over the entire crypto space. And there's essentially the CFTC and the SEC that are kind of fighting each other almost for like, no, this part belongs to my regulatory camp and this part belongs to mine, and suing companies like is happening with Coinbase right now to show where the boundaries are, rather than actually coming out with clear guidelines like, hey, if you run a business in the space, then this is how you should do it. And even to the extent that when we talk to investors, for example, for Zest Protocol, one of the first things these investors ask is like, oh, where are you guys based? The reason they want to know that is if we are based in the US, that would be more difficult. But if we're a team that's not in the US, then it's good, which is probably the first time, right, ever in tech that's happened. So in that way, it's definitely not contributed. But at the same time, I definitely think that America is a very unique place. especially unique because it values progress and technological change. It's likely to change there, and there's a lot of good people putting up a fight for it, and soon hopefully some of the largest financial institutions as well. So then it will become clear how it will go, but it might take some more time.
You saw a lot in the news this week with different spot ETFs and funds like BlackRock trying to make a play in the space. And so I'm curious, with some of that movement, is there the possibility that it could become a mainstay currency here?
Yeah, at least as a financial asset. That's sort of very much where this starts. Just a couple of days ago, Larry Fink, right, from BlackRock, was on CNBC, and they were asking about Bitcoin. And it's like, yeah, it's like an international asset, and it's a bit like digital gold. It's effectively an inflation hedge or something like that. And to have someone like that go on TV to talk about the asset is great. And they will do that because they're like, look, if we promote this thing, then people want to buy it, they'll buy it from us, and then we make fees. It's a very simple game. 5 years ago, he said that Bitcoin is an index of money laundering or something like this, right? So we've gone very far in that 5 years, but incentives are aligned now as well. If he talks about Bitcoin, then people will probably buy more of the BlackRock Bitcoin ETF if it gets approved. That will be a very important moment for the further maturing of Bitcoin as an asset, for people to believe more in its capabilities, to start looking under the hood, right? A bit what we've done, and then see, hey, you can build these kind of innovations on top of it, or you could build that, or you can go in this direction, sending more people down the rabbit hole, and trying to figure out how this thing can do good in their lives or communities is a big plus.
Laura and I are both investors, and I think a lot of our audience is made up of aspiring investors. Putting your kind of investor hat on, where do you think VCs should be spending time in DeFi?
Especially this year, a lot of interesting things have actually started happening on the Bitcoin blockchain, and a lot of very interesting companies are sort of starting to pop up. But yeah, in February, January this year, there was a group of people who figured out a way to put arbitrary data on the Bitcoin blockchain. Right? So you could essentially use that 1 MB per Bitcoin block, not just to put in Bitcoin transactions, but to start putting in images or putting in messages or putting in entire books. It essentially like created or changed Bitcoin from just a financial asset to a sort of data storage layer. And that's a very big change. And there's a lot of people who are thinking of creative ways to store certain data on the Bitcoin blockchain that can then be used as compute or as references for running certain programs, and essentially turning it into that sort of decentralized computing layer that I talked about earlier. That will probably be a very large part of the next crypto wave. People will start thinking of creative ways to anchor whatever they do to Bitcoin and to use it as a way to make other internet applications safer. How you make that actionable? I mean, if you're a professional VC firm, you can start doing a lot of research, like what are smart people trying to do here? What's happening? The individual investor, it's maybe a bit more tricky, but dabbling with things and buying a few things here and there is never a bad idea within the realms of whatever you're willing to lose. That's always a good way to think about it.
And one point of controversy has really been the emissions into the environment. I think specifically, its cryptocurrency activity is estimated to emit 25 to 50 million tons of CO2 each year, on par with emissions from diesel fuel kind of used by US railroads. So we're curious of the efforts that have been made to date and what the future looks like for Bitcoin mining practices.
Bitcoin mining uses a lot of energy. If you think about it, the Bitcoin network is the largest buyer of energy in the world. But that's at the same time where it gets its security from. And the interesting thing is that Bitcoin doesn't really care where the energy comes from. And if anything, like if you want to run a very profitable Bitcoin mining business today, you're trying to look for energy that is free or that is cost sub-zero so that you get paid for to use. And that energy is almost always renewable energy or green energy. That's the type of energy that can be almost free. For example, hydro plants where like no one lives there. It's way too difficult to get all the electricity away from there to households. That's a great place to mine Bitcoin because you basically have access to free energy. And yeah, if anything, it seems very likely, or it is very likely, that essentially Bitcoin will become a huge accelerant for green energy development. People building green energy plants always know that there is at least one buyer for their energy at a certain floor price. And that's the Bitcoin network. Right? You can always start mining Bitcoin or put some mining in place. And yeah, some emissions that are happening at this point in time basically come from the fact that there is some really cheap fossil fuel energy available somewhere. But That's probably something that will reduce over time because it's basically the cheapest source of energy is renewable.
Double clicking on our last macro question is just last week, we read that Brazil, Singapore, Japan made major announcements regarding central bank digital currencies, tokenized assets, and regulatory developments, which is huge. And just given the lack in the US. So, what impact do you think Bitcoin will have on these broader economies? And how will it really decrease the complexity of some of these financial systems abroad?
Central bank digital currencies make a lot of sense. Currently today, the banking system is simply a lot of proprietary databases that are stitched together with services that sort of extract rent, right? That's basically how it works. One bank is a spreadsheet, and then you send money to the other bank, and then there's someone connecting that, and then they charge some money. And you can better just put it all in one spreadsheet, in one overarching spreadsheet, they call the blockchain, and then you can eliminate all these transaction fees. Banks have realized that too, or central banks have realized that too, and central bank digital currencies make a lot of sense in that light. The thing I just wonder about is if CBDCs really get traction. I think it will be a big moment for people where they realize that the emperor maybe doesn't really have that many clothes, right? If it becomes clear, like, oh wait, all this money exists in one database, and how, like, people will start asking more questions about how this works, right? And they will probably come to the conclusion like, okay, so all our money exists in one database, but there's one actor that can create more entries into that database, and how does that affect me? Yeah, CBDCs will have a definitely an interesting effect on the space.
And two personal questions that we have for you. I mean, you've accomplished a lot today. Very impressive. One thing we didn't know was your Forbes under 40 in Europe in 2020. So congrats to that. And we're really curious what motivates you to work hard.
Working on something that matters, right? That's sort of bigger than just yourself. That's the main piece of motivation for me. I'm not sort of particularly motivated by money or recognition or something like that. If you sort of aligned everything for yourself, like, okay, look, this is the thing, this is what I know, this is what I can do, and this is what I care about. And then because I care about this and I know this is the best way I can make an impact. If you can sort of somehow make that very clear for yourself, it becomes very, very easy to get up in the morning and get to work, at least for me. So at some point, I just wrote a little bit of a bullet pointed list, reasoning through, like, okay, I know how to do these things. These are the things I care about. What's the way we're going to help push that forward? And yeah, I guess that's really what keeps me going.
And then what's a piece of advice you'd give your younger self?
Back in the day, I was very hung up on always having a new goal to strive for, but it was maybe a bit arbitrary. We'd be at school, then it would be like, oh, well, if we get this done, then we'll probably get happier. Or like, oh, if I'm at Oxford, then if we manage to achieve this thing or get into this committee, then that's another sort of thing ticked off. At some point, it sort of felt a bit like, okay, this doesn't really produce anything. And this kind of tracked approach, this kind of ladder where I sort of imagine, oh, if you keep doing that, then at some point you're working somewhere, you're trying to make promotions and kind of keep a bit stuck into some sort of cycle. Yeah, to maybe a bit less hung up about that and be more, just follow curiosity a bit more. And yeah, I would say that I always did that quite a bit, but I could have maybe done that a little bit more to arrive at say crypto or Bitcoin maybe a bit earlier than I had now.
Tycho, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and sharing your thoughts and kind of breaking down this complex yet very interesting topic for our listeners.
Oh, great. It was a pleasure.